Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Your Excellencies, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all to our 5th lecture in a series of lectures introducing the true picture of Islamic civilization. But tonight is by all standards a unique and great event. A great scholar talking about a great Muslim philosopher. I don't think I need to introduce Annemarie Schimmel, a lady who wrote over 100 books with a huge wealth of knowledge presented in a real objective manner. I don't think I need to introduce a lady who has more than one PhD, getting it at an early age, getting them even before she is 25 years old. Of course, I don't need to introduce a lady who was a professor in the most famous universities on earth, like Harvard, Bonn, Ankara, and so many others. I don't think I need to introduce a lady who speaks 12 languages, including Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and Urdu. How can I introduce her? She is here tonight. She will introduce herself and show you how God can create someone like Annemarie Schimmel. Iqbal is a famous philosopher in this century, and he wrote poetries on so many aspects. Annemarie cannot handle them all in one night, so she selected only one part, the creative love. That is a gift from Almighty God giving to a mankind, a human being, which really induce him and enable him to have a creative achievement. I will not take much of your time because I'm sure you are as enthusiastic as I am to listen to this great lady. سيداتي وسادتي، مرحبا بكم على مائدة الفكر، غذاؤها الحب الخلاق تنثره في قلوبنا وعقولنا عميدة الاستشراق، أستاذة العلوم الإسلامية في هذا القرن، هذه السيدة التي حباها الله بالعلم الغزير يستفيد منه الكبير والصغير، ومنحها الله الحب الخلاق لتكون بدون شك عميدة الاستشراق. أرحب بكم جميعا في هذه الليلة التي سنسعد بها ونستفيد منها. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it's a wonderful occasion to speak on Iqbal, all the more that Iqbal's birthday was just 2 days ago, on 9th of November. 9th of November 1877, he was born in Sialkot in the Punjab, and he died in Lahore in 1938. Much has been written about Iqbal. Books and books in English and Urdu in various languages, books that are critical of him, books that call him a reactionary and others that call him a progressive. There are not two scholars and lovers of Iqbal who completely agree about him, because his work is a very strange and important combination of Eastern and Western thought. But I personally think he has described his own way and his own work, his ideals, in a sentence he spoke in 1930 at the All India Muslim League meeting in Allahabad. He describes himself as a man who believes that religion is a power of the utmost importance in the life of individuals as well as that of states, and who believes that Islam in itself is destiny and will not suffer a destiny. Let me just say a few words about Iqbal as a poet and a philosopher, so that what I'm going to say later falls in place. Born, as I said, in Sialkot, educated in Lahore, and then in Cambridge, where he studied law and Hegelian philosophy. Then, after a short while in Germany, he returned to Lahore and worked there first as a lawyer and mainly as a poet and thinker. He was invited to various great occasions, including the Round Table Conferences in London in 1931 and 1932. And in 1930, before that, he had pronounced the great wish to see the Punjab, the northwestern frontier, which includes, of course, also Kashmir, Sindh and Balochistan, amalgamated into a single state. That was the birth of today's Pakistan. But what he dreamt of was a kind of state that should be a bulwark for India against the destructive forces that had always come from the northwest, and thinking of Genghis Khan and Timur and of ever so many conquerors, Iqbal knew very well what the role of the Punjab and the northwestern frontier was for the history of India. It was that part that had always been overrun by the conquerors, and he wanted, that was his idea, to create a state in which these dangers were just kept away from the mainland India. And he was also of the opinion that the Muslims should have a say in the building up of their own educational and legal ideals. That was behind his famous speech of 1930. But Iqbal was much more than a politician. He was a philosopher and he was a poet. His first collection of poetry in Urdu, Bangdara, appeared in 1924, 1 year after his first Persian collection. His second Persian collection was published, the Payam-e-Mashriq. But his first Persian poems, as we shall see, were of a different character. His Urdu poetry follows classical models. In 1912, however, for the first time, he cried out against fate. After seeing the situation in Europe, he found that he had to give some strength to the Muslims of India. And so, in his great poem, Shikwa, of 1912, he made the Muslims complain that everything is too difficult and that their old civilization has no role anymore, that God seems to have forgotten them. And in the great poem, Jawab Shikwa, the answer on the complaint, God teaches them what they have done and what they are supposed to do, no longer neglecting the duties of their faith, no longer neglecting the love of God and the Prophet. This was a kind of way into his new phase of life. It is told, and he said it himself, that one night the great Sufi poet Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi appeared to him in a dream and bade him to write a Persian Masnavi, a poem modeled on Rumi's own great book, the Masnavi. Iqbal complied and he wrote in Persian. And it is this Asrar Khudi and its sequence, the Rumuz Bekhudi, which made his fame, which also gave him many attacks from those who thought that he should have rather stayed to the classical tradition of Urdu and Persian poetry, where the self dissolves itself like the fragrance of a rose, and not write things in which the dewdrop is compared to the diamond, the dewdrop dissipating, disappearing, being eaten by birds, and the diamond always stable, always radiant, whatever its fate may be. These ideas seemed very alien to many of the Indians who read his books, but they show a new approach to life in Iqbal's work. Formerly being a Hegelian, a follower of the Cambridge neo-Hegelian MacTaggart, he now turned to the ideals of Bergson and his élan vital, his powerful philosophy, and he tried to embody that in the tradition of Islam. It was not an easy task for him, but he was certainly right in what he was doing. In 1923, as I mentioned briefly, his great Persian work appeared, Payam al-Mashriq, which is particularly dear to us Germans because it is the first and only answer of a Muslim thinker to Goethe's famous collection, Westöstlicher Divan, which in turn was the first German response to Muslim and particularly Persian poetry. Then follow another Persian group of poems, Zabur Ajam, Persian Psalms, and in 1932, a work which to this day is for me the most important work by Iqbal, the Javetname, a story of man's rising through the spheres under the guidance of Maulana Rumi. He comes from the earth and finally reaches eternal beatitude after having talked with the inhabitants of the seven spheres about politics, poetry, mysticism, religion, and so on and so forth. It is a book which contains an almost inexhaustible wealth of ideas, and when I translated it into German, I must say I still think it is a book which everyone should read, perhaps with a commentary. Then follow some Urdu collections, Bala Jibril, Gabriel's Wing, and a very critical political collection of Darb Kalim, as we would say in Arabic, the stroke of Moses, in which he gives his criticism of the Western world and its imitators in the East. And finally, in 1938, after his death on 21st of April, his posthumous poems were collected and published under the title Armaghan Hijaz, the gift of the Hijaz, thus showing that his heart was longing to go to the Hijaz to visit the sacred places of Islam and especially the Rawda of the Prophet. Iqbal's poetry began, as I saw, as a continuation of the traditional Persian and Urdu poetry. But all of a sudden, at the time when he wrote the Asrar Khudi in 1915, he discovered, and he shocked his contemporaries, with his criticism of Hafiz and of Plato. He warned his compatriots not to graze any longer in the beautiful gardens of Iran, but rather return to the sands of Arabia and to drink of the wholesome water of the Zamzam instead of imbibing Persian intoxicating wine, which might be useless for facing the difficulties of life. You can well imagine how a culture that was used to this kind of poetry, namely roses and nightingales and wine and whatever is beautiful and soft, was shocked at hearing these new messages. But Iqbal reminded his readers of the fact that the deer, once it leaves the haram of Mecca, becomes a prey of European hunters. And so the Muslims who forget the center of their religion can easily be caught by the Europeans and can fall a prey to them. His interest in the Arab aspect of Islam, something that has very rarely mentioned in the books about him, goes through his whole life. And I think it is not an accident that at the very end of his life he returned to this feeling. His last letter, written 6 weeks before his death in 1938, closes with a line of the great Persian poet Khaqani, who died in 1199, and this line says, "Do not put the mark of Greek philosophy on the crupper of the horse of religion, which is of Arab origin." Religion was for him that what had been born in Arabia, and just as the Muslims of old, the Sufis, worked against the application of too many Greek ideas in the interpretation of Islam. Thus, Iqbal has as his last word the warning not to become too much illusioned by Greek philosophy and not to interpret the Quranic message in the terminology of Greek philosophy. That is certainly an important message, and it shows you how his main ideals remain the same throughout his whole life. It is natural that a man like Iqbal should find the center of his faith and of his whole life in the Quran. In the Javidnameh, that great vision of his journey through the spheres, he has a whole chapter about the Alam al-Quran, in which he shows or tries to show that the Quran, if it is indeed God's eternal word, must be eternal like God and must be as manifold as God is. In every moment, it will give you a new wisdom, and he himself followed the classical Sufi maxim that unless the Quran is not revealed to you personally, just as it was revealed to the Prophet, then neither the commentaries of Razi or the Kashaf of Zamakhshari are of any use for you. As early as in 1917, he had written in an article that the Quran is brimful of joy of life and light, and there is no place in it for pessimistic mysticism, for something gloomy and dark. A sentence which certainly is highly interesting in the light of his later philosophy. It is this joy of life, this complete enthusiasm about the words of the Quran as they have been revealed to the Prophet, which is so typical of his work. And that brings us quite naturally to the role of the Prophet of Islam in his work. Iqbal was deeply in love with the Prophet. To be sure, he has not written classical Na'tiya poetry, and yet in one of his later works he has something that is inspired by the great Burda of Al-Busiri, because when he was ailing, he was reminded again in a dream by Sir Sayyid Ahmed Khan, the reformer of Islam, to turn to the Prophet and ask him for help, just as Busiri in the 13th century was cured and wrote his great Burda in praise of the Prophet. But there is more to it. For Iqbal, the Prophet is the most important manifestation of the spirit of Islam. In the Javidnama, you find this very daring sentence: you can deny God, but you cannot deny the Prophet. The Prophet is the one who brought Islam to the fore and who interpreted what he had received in his revelations. And he was, as Iqbal repeats time and again, the ideal person, not the insan al-kamil of Sufism, but his quality is that of abduhu, as he is called twice in the Quran, the servant of God, which is, according to Iqbal, as it was to the classical Sufis, the ideal personality at all. It is this love of the Prophet which permeates his whole work. And it is much more important to see that than many other aspects of his work. Of course, Iqbal has used in his interpretation of the Quran the figures of the previous prophets, and he has praised Abraham, the one who is the first true monotheist, because he believed that the survival of the Muslim nations lies in the ethical monotheism which is represented by Abraham. But even dearer to him was Moses, the Kalimullah, and it's not astonishing that he called his last great poetical work in Urdu, Darb Kalim, the stroke of Moses, because just as Moses cleft the mountains asunder to bring water out of the rock, and just as he cleft the Red Sea so that his people could pass, thus he wanted to show that with a hard stroke one can certainly save, or at least come closer to salvation of the Muslims of our days. Moses, he who had the Yad Bayda, the white hand, is for him the model of the miracle-working prophet. And both of them, Abraham and Moses, appear, as it is correct, as forerunners of the Prophet of Islam. Jesus, however, doesn't play any important role in his work because he was certainly an admirer of him, as we can see from the Javidname, but Christianity was too much connected in the minds of the Indian Muslims of the 19th and 20th century with colonialism and with imperialism. And so the role of Jesus in the works, not only of Iqbal, but also of other thinkers and poets, is not as great as it is in classical Persian poetry. The figure, however, of the Prophet of Islam is central to his whole thought. Already in 1912, he writes in the answer to the complaint, "Light the world so long in darkness with Muhammad's radiant name." But perhaps the most beautiful descriptions of the role of the Prophet are found in his second Persian Masnavi, the Rumuz-e-Bekhudi, the mysteries of selflessness, which is his most political and at the same time most Quran-oriented work, where he says, "The love of the Prophet runs like blood through the veins of the community." And another verse, which I always found so particularly beautiful, is when he compares the Ummah, the community of the Muslims, to a rose with 100 leaves, a true centifolia, with one fragrance, and the fragrance is the spirit of the Prophet. I have rarely found any more beautiful descriptions of the role of the Prophet than this simple line. And even more, Iqbal felt that he was very closely related in spirit to the Prophet. It is his conviction that just as the Prophet showed the exact model of the abduhu, of the slave of God, who is free and at the same time bound to God, is the ideal of humanity. And when you look at his poetical language, you will find that in two very auspicious places, he alludes to the role of the prophet. One is rather easy to understand, the other one is a little bit more difficult to detect, but even more important. The title of his first Urdu collection, Bangedra, means the sound of the caravan bell. And he found himself in the role of the little bell that is bound to the feet of the camel of the prophet in order to show by its sound the way back to the center, to Mecca. This is an image that can easily be understood by everyone. The second one occurs in the Javidname. Rumi is asked by some of the spirits in the spheres, what is his name? And he said his name is Zindarud. Now Zindarud means living stream, and that would be a beautiful poetical name in any case. However, go back to Goethe, his great master, and you find in Goethe's Westöstlicher Divan the description of Muhammad as the stream. In Mahomet's Gesang, this image is elaborated just like the stream begins from a small fountain and then becomes larger and larger and finally ends up in the all-embracing ocean. Thus, the prophet can also be seen beginning from a small root and then embracing more and more and more people and countries. Iqbal had translated this poem in a very free version in his Payam-e-Mashriq, and he has found, which Goethe could not know, that exactly this image has been used already in the 10th century by the Shia theologian Kulaini in order to call the prophet with a wonderful symbol. And so Iqbal himself feels that in his work he is an imitator of the prophet, not a prophet of course, but someone who follows closely his steps. And I think when we keep that in mind, we understand much more of some of his ideas. One of his last poems expresses his wish to go to the Rawda in Medina, where the prophet is buried. He never performed the Hajj, nor did he perform the visit of the tomb of the prophet in Medina. But in one of his last lines, he writes, "Old as I am, I'd still go to Medina to sing my song there, full of love and rest, just like a bird who, in the desert night, spreads out his wings when thinking of his nest." That was his central thought. However, there's also something else in his love of the prophet. In the 5th chapter of his famous lectures on the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam, he begins with a tale from an Indian Sufi of the mid-16th century. This sentence runs, "Muhammad of Arabia went to the highest heaven and returned. I swear by God, if I had reached this place, I would have never returned." And then he continues that this is the attitude of a great Sufi. The Sufi wants to remain in the eternal happiness of God and not to return to the world, while the prophet comes back in order to preach what he has experienced in the immediate neighborhood of God and to teach mankind what God has inspired to him. Now this is, of course, a very interesting application of the category in the history of religion which discerns between the mystical and the prophetic approach to religion. And Iqbal was certainly a great representative of the so-called prophetic representation of the so-called prophetic approach to religion. He was the one who wanted to preach what he had felt and experienced. In the history of Islam, you can see this example very clearly in the life of the Prophet. I don't know if Iqbal thought of it, but it is certainly a fact that after the first experiences in the cave of Hira, where the Prophet had the first revelations, he went out to preach what he had learned. And in a second case, after Mecca, he left his hometown in order to go into the world and create a state, a basis for Islamic life in the community. This cooperation of what Iqbal calls jilwa, the manifestation, and khalwa, the being with God in seclusion, is something that is also visible in other aspects of his thought, namely in his great emphasis on the two aspects of life. Everyone knows that life can exist only in polarities. The heartbeat, the breathing, everything is certainly bound to be like, as Goethe says, in breathing there are two kinds of blessings. Once you take in the breath and then you take it out again. You inhale and exhale. And the same is true for systole and diastole, for the heartbeat. Nothing can be without this twofold activity. And that is also true and can be applied to God. I remember when I was a professor at Ankara, I tried to teach my Muslim students that our German philosopher Rudolf Otto had described God under the categories of the mysterium tremendum, the tremendous, frightening mystery, and the mysterium fascinans, the fascinating mystery. And one of my students got up and said, but we Muslims have known that for the last 1,000 years. We speak of God's Jalal, the majesty, and his Jamal, his beauty, and these are the two aspects under which he has revealed himself. There is an idea which Iqbal also takes up, although we have to say that in his idea of the divine power, the Jalal side is somewhat stronger than the Jamal side. But how does he see this God, whom he describes like that? God is, for him, the greatest ego. His philosophy of khudi, of egohood, is something that has been criticized by many Western scholars and also by Eastern scholars, because the word khudi in Persian usually means egotism, selfishness, and so on and so forth. However, if you go back to the 13th century and you read Maulana Rumi, you will find that in his prose work he uses khudi exactly in the sense of, as Iqbal uses, namely the innermost being of a person or of a thing. It is the essence par excellence. And so, for Iqbal, everything in the world consists of smaller and greater egos, of khudis in various forms. And God, for him, is the greatest ego. One cannot describe him. We all know that it is impossible to reach the Deus absconditus, the God that is never to be reached by intellect or by love or by any possibility. But we can at least approach him when he reveals himself in his word. But what we know, so that says Iqbal in his lectures, is that God has described himself as an individual, as an ego, by calling himself in the Quran by the name of Allah. That shows that he is something or somewhat or some who personal, someone to whom I can turn. And we are reminded of modern European philosophers of religion, such as Paul Tillich, the great Protestant theologian, who said, the divine has to be given as a thou, because there is no possibility for me to come into a loving encounter with an undescribable and far away neutral being. God is the greatest ego in which everything is contained, and after all, as the Quran says, he calls men to call upon him. Ud'uni fastajab. That is, for Iqbal, the proof for God's great egohood. And what he describes about him in his poetry is mainly one aspect, and that is what he calls kibriya, the divine grandeur, an expression which he has taken doubtlessly from the poetry of Rumi, in which God is always described as kibriya. And most of you will know the beautiful hadith Qudsi, which runs, Al-Kibriya Ridai, the Kibriya, the grandeur, is my cloak. So that is one aspect which we can hope to touch at least a little bit. Religion, for Iqbal, has to be wedded to power. Power is dangerous and satanic when it is different from religion, but the two together have to work to build up a better new world. For Iqbal, God is the one who is Al-Hayy Al-Qayyum, and he loves the Quranic saying, Kullu yawmin huwa fi sha'n, and he interprets it in a philosophical way in his lectures when he says, the not yet of God means unfailing realization of the infinite creative possibilities of his being, which retains its wholeness throughout the entire process. That means God creates constantly, he works constantly, but he never changes in his being. It is also important to see Iqbal's interpretation of the words of the Shahada. The interplay of the La and the Illah, which has been interpreted very often by the medieval mystics, seems to be extremely important for him, because without Allah, without negation, there cannot be an affirmation. From the La, you go up to the Illah, and as Persian poets would say, from the La, you go to the Ba-La, to the higher. So again, the play between the La and the Illah forms an important aspect of his poetry and his philosophy. And here we come to an interesting interpretation of life by Iqbal. Many people have claimed that he was strongly under the influence of Nietzsche, the German philosopher. Iqbal has placed him in the Javetname, in a place beyond the spheres, and he shows that Nietzsche remained in the La, in the negation, by negating God, and he failed to reach the affirmation. He remained bound to the negative aspect, and had he done one step further, thus says Iqbal, then he would have found the real religious attribute. He would have found the God of whom he thought that he had died. And here we come to Iqbal's interpretation of the human being. Nietzsche was supposed to be responsible for Iqbal's idea of man as a great fighter, as man as a kind of superman, and similar concepts which were very common in European philosophy at the beginning of our century. However, Iqbal's Mard Mu'min, that is, Al-Insan al-Mu'min, has nothing in common with Iqbal's Superman, with Nietzsche's Superman, because Nietzsche's Superman appears only after God has died. And this idea was, of course, inconceivable for a pious thinker like Iqbal. Nor has Iqbal's ideal man anything of the Insan al-Kamil as he was developed in the Sufi philosophy. Rather, Iqbal's ideal believer is the one who is a co-worker with God, who completes many things on this ground, in this earth, and ameliorates what has to be done. One of the most famous poems in the Payam al-Mashriq is a discussion between God and man. And man proudly addresses God. You made the night, and I the lamp. You made the clay, and I the cup. You made the deserts, forests, mountains high. I, flower beds and orchards and the park. It's me who grinds the mirror out of stone. It's me who brews from poison antidote. Now you could say that this is a very high ambition of man, and perhaps a dangerous ambition. And many critics, especially in the West, have accused Iqbal of creating a very self-conscious human being who has no respect for God. But that is not true. I would say that the Mard al-Mu'min, the Insan al-Mu'min, is the one who in himself has the paradox of freedom and servantship. And in this respect, he is again the ideal person as manifested by the Prophet, namely as Abduhu, God's servant, which means servantship in freedom. That is how Iqbal, according to my understanding, defined the role of man. And something that is absolutely important and which belongs to our theme of creative love is that this man is nothing of a static person. There is a constant growth. For Iqbal, the whole universe is growing in every minute, in every second. Even the smallest ego wants to show itself, wants to assume a higher place, and so this rising gamut of egohood goes through everything created. And in this rising gamut of egohood, in this manifestation of the best qualities of man, there is one important aspect, the struggle against Iblis, against Satan. It may sound strange that Iqbal has given such a prominent role to the satanic powers, and we may be shocked when we read his descriptions. However, Iqbal's Satan has in himself trends from various literary and religious traditions. On the one hand, he is a haughty person who said, Ana khair, I am better than Adam, and was then cursed. On the other hand, he has much of Goethe's Mephistopheles, who is given by God to man in order to test him and thus to help to his growth. This is the favorite aspect of Satan in Iqbal's work. He has described his activities in a great 5-part poem in the Payam al-Mashriq called Taskhir al-Fitrat, the overcoming of the nature, and he describes how Adam was cast out of paradise and then spent his life in struggling with the powers of evil. And it was only through this struggle that he assumed a real human personality. This fighting against heavy odds, the fighting against the satanic powers, that is what man is called to. And so Satan, in one of Iqbal's poems, can proudly say, it's me who gives color to life. The most impressive description of this satanic development is at the end of the Falak al-Mushtari, the sphere of Jupiter, in the Javidname. There, Satan appears, an old man, very sad, just as Nietzsche had described him, and he complains of man. Why? Because man is much too stupid to understand his temptations, and it's no fun for an old devil to fight with such a stupid creature. What Satan wants, and he prays to God, is please give me a mature human being, one who fights with me and who overcomes me at the end. And then, and this is Iqbal's ingenious solution, then Iblis, overcome by the perfect, faithful man, will finally perform the sajda, the prostration, which he refused before the immature Adam at the beginning of times. I think this is one of the most ingenious myths invented by our poet, and it is very touching to read this complaint of poor Iblis who feels so bored with us human beings. But Iqbal knows, of course, that the Iblis of fire, the one who once did not perform the prostration before Adam, is comparatively interesting and even useful for the development of human beings. However, there are other Iblises. They are made of clay, human devils who are much worse than the real devil. And with the expression, the Iblis of clay, he takes up an expression which already in the 11th century was used by the great Ismaili philosopher Nasir Khusraw, to whom Iqbal owes a lot of inspiration. It is this kind of devils who appear more and more in his later work, and one of his most tragic poems is about the discussion of Satan with his political disciples, in which many of the developments which we have seen during the last decades are really foreseen with a visionary power. And yet, I would say that the role of Iblis as the one who brings man to higher spheres and to higher stages of life is extremely important, because as I said, there is always the wish to reach higher and higher. And the development of self is strengthened by the fight with the forces of evil. The more we fight, the higher we can reach. It is this aspect which is most important in Iqbal's work. And he thinks, and again, here he takes up classical ideas, that in great action alone, the self of man becomes united with God without losing his own identity. That's important. It's not a fading away of the mystic in God. It is the development of the self which comes closer and closer to God. So united with God without losing his own identity and transcends the limit of time and space. Action is the highest form of contemplation. Thus he says in the lectures, after describing the importance of prayer and communal prayer in most beautiful words. But here in this sentence, I would ask you to look at the word of time. The self, in great struggle, transcends time and space. And Iqbal's concept of time is of great importance for the understanding of all his thoughts. He has seen time on a twofold level, the afaki and the anfusi, the one that is connected with the outward world and the one which we have ourselves in our hearts. And in the Javidname, he makes appear the old Iranian deity of time, Zurvan, and he teaches man that it is important to tear the zunar, the infidel's girdle of time. Because time, once it comes into existence, once it is here for man, and we see it second after second, year after year, this looks like a long, long belt, a belt as, according to the tradition, the infidels would wear. The true faithful believer is the one who tears this zunnar, this girdle, this belt, and for a single moment finds himself in the time of God, which is without before and without after. It is the great experience of love when we grasp infinity in a single moment. The idea of Iqbal is, however, that our life develops, but not just by accident. It is our actions and especially our thoughts and our dreams which color our development. It is our unconscious ideas which slowly come into consciousness and form and shape our lives. And this is an idea which had also been expressed by Goethe in very beautiful words. It is the man who dreams up something who finally will be able to realize it, or at least to come close to his goals. And this, for Iqbal, is also true for our attitude to God and to life, and most importantly, to death. As early as 1910, in his personal reflections, stray reflections, a little notebook, he had noted down, personal immortality is not a state, it is a process. And he goes even farther. He believes that personal immortality is not something that is here for everyone. It is something that is given only to the strong ones. The person who has overcome the shock of corporeal death can develop in the end, in the divine presence, farther and farther. This is, of course, an idea that was unacceptable to many of his orthodox contemporaries and is still a matter of criticism for many who like Iqbal. However, for him, death and eternity are something that has to be seen from a completely different angle. Death is man's experience of what he has lived in life. And so for Iqbal, hell is nothing but the complaint and the suffering of the human ego, which has failed to fulfill his ambitions and has not realized his goals. Heaven, however, he says, heaven is the joy of triumph over the forces of disintegration. Heaven is not a static paradise. Heaven is growing without diminishing. And he even coins the lovely sentence, heaven is no holiday. We still have to develop ourselves in eternity, because if it is a real eternal life, then it must continue through the ages and through eternity. Interestingly, and I was always fascinated by this coincidence, almost the same ideas, almost verbatim the same ideas, are found in a book that was written at the same time when Iqbal wrote his lectures in Sweden by the Swedish Lutheran bishop Tor André, who was a great Islamicist and who has, in his book Die letzten Dinge, the last things, developed the idea that death is not the end of our life, but it's just the beginning of a new stage, something which you also find in classical Sufism. When the journey to God is finished, the journey in God continues. But, of course, such an interpretation of hell and paradise was considered dangerous by many of the old-fashioned believers. Yet I personally think this is something that is extremely important in our appreciation of Iqbal's work. And here, the creative love comes in. What is this love? Love is, in Iqbal's work, that what Bergson, the philosopher whom he appreciated very much, calls the élan créatrice. It is the power that creates values and that is never satisfied with what it has created. It is a power that changes every moment what is in man and what we have to understand. The symbol for the experience, as Iqbal said, of intuition in which the mystic grasp reality in its wholeness in a single undiscernible moment. Love is this experience which we have, which the believer may have in the middle or at the end of his road. Love is the desire to assimilate, to absorb. It is, as he writes, the highest form of the creation of values and ideals and the endeavor to realize them. So when we spoke about the rising gamut of egohood or whatever we want to use, this is impossible without creative love. Every moment, everything we do, it has to be done with this élan vital in the bergson general. Rumi, who was Iqbal's great master in Sufism and in spiritual thought, has very similar ideas, and some of Iqbal's hymns to love, as we may call them, are almost word by word taken from Rumi's Masnavi. On the other hand, I may just add here, the philosophy or theosophy of Ibn Arabi was very alien to him. He praised Ibn Arabi in his dissertation of 1908. However, in the long run, he found him too much tinged by Neoplatonic ideas and too much theosophical and not vital enough. But Rumi appears time and again as his great master who teaches him not only the secrets of the self, but also the secrets of love. Love is to live with fire under one's feet. And it is the power that moves people into true religion. In a very daring verse, at the end of his life, Iqbal says, "The burning and unrest of one real Allahu Akbar does not fit into the 5 ritual prayers. That is, it transcends even the prescribed religious forms because it's so powerful that it is much stronger and much more impressive than anything else." And when you read such a line, you understand why Iqbal, who himself was deeply interested in Islamic law and who has tried to interpret Islam from the most difficult modern viewpoints, that he was very much against Mullahism and Pirism. He thought that Pirism, the role of the peers in the modern Islamic world, was very dangerous because it was against true love and true life. It was just a general sweeping feeling and the idea that the peer knew everything better, which of course would be not very helpful in introducing new ideas such as Iqbal wanted. And Mullahism, the role of the mullahs, the interpreters of the law, who created layer over layer of interpretations, of hashias, of corrections, and so on and so forth, to the books of law and on the Quran, they seemed to him equally important because they did not understand anything of the burning power of love. And he has a wonderful comparison of the mullah who looks like Qarun. Qarun, as you know, was buried alive under the weight of his wealth. And for Iqbal, the mullah is a Qarun of Arabic dictionaries. He has only these hundreds of dictionaries out of which he tries to find the meaning of the Quran and of the Hadith. Iqbal knows that this burning love is something that shows itself in human prayer. But prayer is not done for the sake of the individual. The individual may pray as much as he wants, but he should not complain when God does not grant his wish. The most important is that in prayer, in contact with the divine, with the living God, man should be changed himself. Then prayer is useful when God gives him the possibility of becoming his co-worker and to accept the divine will as his own will. And only then he will also be able, by his prayers, to change the world. I think that is another aspect of Iqbal's thought which is worthy of our interpretation. It is natural that this love, ashq, as Iqbal calls it, is contrasted very frequently with ilm, with scholarship and science. He uses it mostly in the English sense of science, as natural science, and also with aql, with the intellect. Ashq is synthesis, ilm is analysis, and both of them have to work together. In a great poem, a Persian poem in the Payam al-Mashriq, Iqbal shows that without love, without this analytical approach, ilm, science, is something satanic. But if both of them cooperate, they can create paradises on earth. It is one of his finest expressions of his belief in analytical thinking instead of dry, in synthetical thinking instead of dry analytical approach. And in his poetry, he has compared the man who relies only on science to a bookworm who lives in the beautiful pages of Al-Farabi and Al-Razi and never knows anything of real life. And he is contrasted with the moth, the butterfly, who casts himself into the flames in order to experience one moment of ecstasy. Ashq for Iqbal is comparable to the Prophet Mustafa, while aql, the dry intellect, is Abu Lahab. And as he says in a poem in which he brings together Goethe and his own Eastern guide, Maulana Rumi, he quotes a line to which both agree, that cunning intellect is from Satan, but love, ashq, is from Adam. Perhaps even more beautiful and more understandable, at least for a Muslim audience, is his verse that science is the son of the book, but love is the mother of the book. Love is Kitab, and love is what is behind everything, behind every revelation. Intellect, he says, is the open question. Love is the hidden answer. He has never tired of describing this love in the most beautiful and sometimes also very exotic images. I think the secret of this daring love is very well expressed in a verse from his later period when he says, "Love leaps into Nimrod's fire without hesitation. Intellect is still busy with looking from the roof. Intellect thinks and doesn't dare to annihilate itself in the flames of love, but love is careless because it knows that there is the real way, burning oneself in the flames of God." And in another verse in which he uses an image very dear to classical Persian poetry, that of the great conqueror king Mahmud of Ghazna, who conquered the idol temple of Somnath in India, he says, "The whole world bows in adoration to love. Love is the Mahmud that conquers the Somnath of intellect." That is, intellect is something like an idol temple which has to be conquered by the all-embracing love. Ideas which we find very similar in Maulana Rumi's work, but which are put here in a more modern context and therefore are more relevant to all of us. But he knows also, and that is important to keep in mind, that love should never be fulfilled. When Paul Tillich, whom I quoted already once, the German theologian of our time, says, "Fulfilled love is at the same time extreme happiness and an end of happiness, because only through separation one can become active. The reed started to sing when it was cut off from the reed bed. Without separation, there cannot be activity and fertility. And so we find in Iqbal's work one of the most important aspects, what he calls in Persian, koshish no tamam, the never finished striving. Here again, he's close to Goethe and his poetry, which he writes, for instance, about his meeting with the virgins of paradise or with anything else, is always permeated by this constant burning of unfulfilled love. Because only while still waiting to reach the goal, a human being can become active and can create values. And the stronger his longing is, the stronger and the greater are the values he may be able to create. It is this koshish and tamam, this longing, this constant search for more and more closeness, for approximation to the highest values that colors Iqbal's thought. And he has expressed his ideas not only in the philosophical prose of his 6 lectures, which were given in 1928, but even more in his poetry. Many people, especially Western critics, have found contradictions in Iqbal's philosophical prose. That is possible. Perhaps for some people it was too strange how he welded together European philosophy and classical Islamic thought. And yet, I personally think that one has always to read together his works, be they in Urdu or in Persian, and his philosophical writings. Only then can we understand the breadth and the width of his greatness. And he himself, strangely enough, has claimed that he wrote poetry only for practical purposes. Poetry, as he saw it, was an art which has only value when it makes people creative. The highest art is that which awakens our dormant will force and nerves us to face the trials of life manly. That is his idea, and for this reason did he, as I mentioned in the beginning, criticize the most beautiful poetry by Hafiz. His own poetry was written, as he claims, for practical purposes because the people in the subcontinent were not used to read philosophical statements or to listen to many long sermons, but they wanted poetry. They could be approached by poetry, and Iqbal's poetry, everyone who has read him will agree, is extremely strong, has a very strong rhythm, and could be memorized immediately. And thus his ideas became more and more known. He has transformed in his poetry many of the old symbols without discarding them, because after all, people were used to listening to bulbuls, to nightingales, and looking at roses. But these traditional symbols have been changed in their meaning, and they have also been partly replaced by others. His bird of love, his bird of soul, is not so much the complaining nightingale, it is rather the falcon, the powerful bird who carries away his prey and who carries away man's heart. For the falcon, there is no end in searching. He is not soft, not weak, but every moment there are new horizons before him, horizons which stretched from star to sun and moon and beyond all the spheres into eternity. And many Pakistanis of our day have painted this falcon in front of the blue sky and have written the lines that before you there are still many new horizons on their paintings. And when the falcon is his soul bird, so to speak, as it was incidentally also in Rumi's poetry, then his beloved flower is the lala, the tulip. One of his first collections of Persian poetry in the Message of the East is called Lale-i-Tur, the tulip of Sinai, because the tulip resembles a flame, and just as Moses saw the flame of God in the burning bush, thus the whole desert, all the hillsides are covered with the small red tulips, which remind the poet of the manifestation of God's kibriya, of God's grandeur in the world. And he often compares the faithful believer to a tulip which is lonely and which opens with all her willpower to shine in the darkness. He even says that on his tomb there will grow tulips to show that here a burning heart has been buried. And the same way of speaking of classical symbols is also used in his transformation of figures. Just to give you one example, the martyr mystic Al-Hallaj, who was killed in Baghdad in 922 and who is notorious in Islamic history for his word, Ana al-Haq, I am the creative truth, he appears in the Javidname as the great master of creative love. It is he who tells Iqbal in the sphere of Jupiter that he is a sort of forerunner of him, because it is he who wanted to bring resurrection to a mentally and spiritually dead people. And Iqbal, so is implied, does want to do the same. Hallaj becomes the prototype of his own work to bring spiritual resurrection to people who seem to him spiritually dead. I think this too shows the depths of his feeling for the past and for the future likewise. It is interesting to see that a German philosopher, Rudolf Panritz, who came from the school of Nietzsche, has developed a great liking for Iqbal. We often discussed him in previous years before his death. And in one of his books, he has written a chapter with the title, Das Zeitgedicht. This is a word that can be translated only with great difficulties. It is a poem that really means something that is more than a poem. It is a spiritual, a political message. And as Panritz writes, the Zeitgedicht discharges in the hearts of the contemporaries a productive process which is stronger than any present time and is able to tear out the future from the womb of the present. I think that is exactly what applies to Iqbal's poetry, because he was a poet who wanted to create new values and who wanted to show his people a new way. It is this kind of poetry of which he himself says in the Javidname, if the aim of poetry is to create and to shape true men, then poetry is the heir to prophecy. That's a daring word, and he says it in the context of his own role in the world as he sees it in the Javidname. Iqbal was certainly one of those poets whose poetry was an heir to prophecy. Hermann Hesse, our great German writer, wrote a wonderful introduction to my German translation of the Javidname, in which he describes Iqbal, among other things, that he dreams of a human race that is united in the name of Allah and in his service. I think that is an excellent description of our great poet-philosopher. Iqbal himself said in the lectures, the world life intuitively sees its own needs and at critical moments defines its own direction. That is what in the language of religion we call prophetic revelation. Of course, he does not mean that anyone after Muhammad is a prophet, because for him the abolition of prophethood is the birth of inductive intellect. But he knows that there are powers in the world spirit, if we may say, that know what the world needs. And perhaps taking his inspiration from this sentence in the lectures, perhaps also from a different viewpoint, Bishop Kenneth Craig has said about Iqbal that he is the spokesman of something deep within the contemporary soul. The age then must have felt its need of him. If this is true, then we can certainly say that for Iqbal, it is valid what he says about the ideal poet, namely that the poet is a heart in the breast of the nation. And a poet who teaches us this mystery, the secret of creative love, can certainly be called a heart in the breast, not only of his own nation, but of all nations. And let me close with his hymn to creative love, as he has written it in his great Urdu poem, the Masjid of Cordoba, the Mosque of Cordoba, which he wrote when he was in Spain, and which is one of his most famous poems. Here he sees in the Mosque of Cordoba the great power of creative love, which has formed the civilization of Muslim Spain and of Islam in general. He says, love is Gabriel's heart. Love is Muhammad's strong breath. Love is the envoy of God. Love is the word clear of God. Even the clay figure sea touched by love's ecstasy glows. Love is a new pressed wine. Love is the goblet of kings. Love that is Mecca's jurist. Love the commander of hosts. Love is the son of the road. Thousands of places are his. Love is a plectrum that plays tunes on the taut strings of life. Love is life's radiant light. Love is the fire of life.